My name's Wendy J Fox. I'm your moderator. We have a super awesome panel of writers who have roots in one way or another in Eastern Washington. And thanks to the wonderful Leavenworth-based A Book for All Seasons for hosting us. So each one of us is going to read just a little bit and talk about what place means to us and take any questions. I really encourage everyone to ask any question that you have. Again, just use the question feature that's in the very bottom of your tray on the Zoom panel. And I'll put some links to books in the chat function, and you can also chat with the panelists if you have a question that you would like to ask to someone specifically. So with that, I'll just get started. So welcome to all of our panelists. Thank you guys for doing this. I'll just go around and do the intros, starting with Bruce Holbert. Bruce Holbert is the author of 3 novels, most recently Whiskey and the Hour of Lead, and he grew up in several of Washington's small towns, but Grand Coulee, where his family has lived for generations, is the place that he always calls home. Polly Buckingham is an Artist Trust Fellowship recipient and the author of the short story collection, The Expense of a View, the chapbook, A Year of Silence, and the new book of poetry, The River People. She teaches at Eastern Washington University. Gregory Spatz grew up in New York, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, and has lived in at least a dozen other states before he landed in Spokane, where he has been teaching fiction for more than 2 decades. He directs the MFA program at EWU, and his most recent books are What Could Be Saved and the novel Inukshuk. Paula Coomer lives in Eastern Washington, where she coaches authors and promotes writing within the community. Her newest book, Somebody Should Have Scolded the Girl, was a BuzzFeed recommended title. Noé Álvarez grew up in Yakima and recently relocated back to Seattle. He is the author of Spirit Run, a 6,000-mile marathon through North America's stolen land, a New York Times Book Review editor's choice. And I'm Wendy. I'm originally from Tonasket, Washington. I live in Denver these days. I'm the author of 4 books of fiction, including the novel If the Ice Had Held and the forthcoming short story collection, What If Seasons, again in Leavenworth. Send some business their way. They are super awesome. So I will kick off reading and then we will go back around the room. So again, folks attending, thank you so much for your time, and put any questions that you have into the chat or use the question panel that's in the bottom of your tray. I'm going to read from my forthcoming collection, What If We Were Somewhere Else? Looks weird with the virtual background, but I think it's also kind of appropriate because there's a weird little space person on the front of it. It's a book of short stories. They're linked. You don't necessarily have to know anything about it, even though they are linked. But I'm reading from this section because while the book is set in Colorado, it's actually very inspired by my experiences growing up in rural Eastern Washington. In my office, my coworkers complained about the HVAC. They complained about Kate, my boss, and they complained about the roaches that crept around the copy machine and slunk through the restrooms. I didn't like the roaches either, but the complaining, it just wore me out. The summer when I was 13, I slept outside, sometimes at the foot of Barban's yurt while she stayed in my bedroom. That summer, she was in love with Pablo, but they needed space. And sometimes in the soft grass that had grown up around one of the converted school buses where a boy I liked lived with his parents. His name was Jay, short for Jaybird, because as a child, he had squawked at everything. The circle where I had grown up had never been a planned commune. A few wood-framed houses, some inherited land, and then a fire pit, a steam lodge, and what became an outdoor kitchen, and then a ring of converted buses and vans, campers extended by tarps and wall tents, yurts, army surplus gear, 4 teepees, and the occasional bivy sack nestled between, wood smoke and drums, garden sheds filled with beef and marijuana hanging to dry, the ticking of solar panels and the occasional roar of a generator, carpets of pine needles, of gravel, of mud, of snow, bare feet, bee boxes, herb gardens, a spring-fed well, the outhouses off to the side, flanked by the collection of working and half-working rigs that belonged to anyone who could reach the pedals or who was willing to take a chance on a roll start, either a push from behind or pushing yourself half in and half out of the cab, gripping the wheel while nudging the rickety truck down the incline. And as the speed picks up just at the bottom, just where it's about time to pound the powerless brakes, jam the gear into first and pop the clutch and cross your fingers for the engine to engage. If it works, you'll lurch some, but hope is also like that. In the office, I always took the stairs, and I wore a set of white headphones connected to an old Walkman I had found at the Goodwill. I listened to tapes of bird calls or studio sessions with Peter Tosh. I also liked Vivaldi and Cat Stevens because both put me in a good mood. In our home study, we'd learned that dreadlocks were not only worn by us, circle people, a mostly white group in the mountains, but also by ascetics, Islamic dervishes, and sadhu Hindus who have left behind all material attachments to live in caves and forests and temples. It was a right, and we could choose it at puberty, and for girls on their first menses. I was 11. We didn't think we were appropriating hair. We were Samson, we thought. We were Rasta. We were our own Nazarites. I had hitchhiked to Denver and found work in a natural food store that hired me on the spot based on my knowledge of essential oils alone. When I later talked to my mother about trying for an office job, I could hear her frowning. It had been hard to get her on the phone. There was only a single receiver in the circle, and frequently the bill was unpaid. Is this about money? Maybe you should get a roommate, she told me. It's not natural to live alone. You don't see this in nature. Bears are solitary, Mom. Bears are an exception, she said. Moose are solitary, I said. You're not a moose, though, or a bear. You're a human animal. Get a roommate. At first, I had tried to untangle my dreads. The natural food store had a cream that was supposed to help loosen the hair, and I applied it and soaked my scalp in a bucket of hot water. Then I started at the ends, trying to pick the strands loose, but mostly the hair broke off and ended up on my floor. After a week of this, I only had a few inches free, and I was out of cream. It was easier to just shave than I thought. First, I clipped close to my scalp with my kitchen scissors, and then it seemed so simple to take off what was left, razor sparkling. The shock turned out to be the slow kind, catching my reflection in a window, bald head wrapped in a scarf, or later, when there was just a pinky's length of hair, it was curling. As a child, my hair had been desperately straight. I wondered what else I would find out about myself. Thanks. And I wanted to read that section because, you know, you think about you're in a certain place that you grew up and it always kind of affects you, which is, I think, one of the things that we'll sort of talk about as we think about, you know, Eastern Washington and what place means. So, Bruce, you're up next.
Hello. This is from a new novel called Hank Williams Doesn't Live Here Anymore. I rarely write in the first person, so this is a little of a venture for me. I'm writing about a guy who is at the beginning of Alzheimer's, and he's speaking to his children through a series of tapes. I don't sleep like I once did. I tally my 8 hours. But they might come 1 hour after breakfast, 2 more before dinner, and another following. Then a night of 4 hours of sleep, and the same awake. That's a long time to be by yourself. My life before you guys, well, there are several sorts of alone, and I found my share. But now I'm used to company. You, your mom. When you were little, the house buzzed like a bee farm. Now it's quieter, but your mom, she's half of me. And when she's asleep, well, I'm awake, navigating a fog, somewhere between her and me, floating without shape. I get scared. But then I remember half of me is with her, asleep and safe. Sometimes when I lie awake, my mind returns to the voice on these tapes. It's borrowed, I realize. The syntax and inflections, the manner in which I leave out prepositions or end sentences before they complete a thought belong to this place. Words and sentences, they get born from necessity. You need a tool nobody sells on the shelf or nobody sells the hardware, so you build it. Then you want it, but it's on the shelf downstairs and you've got one hand holding up a fuel pump. So you holler for help, but nobody can respond because the tool doesn't have a name. And even if it does, it's a name in your head that they don't know. You say, get that thing on the counter that looks like a thumb on top of a beer can, but smaller. In the confusion, I don't know turns I don't want to, and we'll see turns not likely. In conversations, people hunt for reasons to speak their piece, laugh in the right place, or grin or nod. Even a nod is vague. It either says, I'm coming along, or I'm ignoring you. I've been there before. We talk around things, what we think. We talk around what we think, punctuating banal conversations with the weather and such, inserting pokes to keep each other wary or attempts at humor, sometimes both at once. I wonder if my father had borrowed this language too, from his father and so on. And from what source did the sound emerge? What emotion, what practical considerations? I don't ever sound like myself. It's like speech is a muscle. Talking limbers it up. The first time I listened to my voice on this tape was foreign to me as something on an answering machine. It's got a pitch, like I'm asking about something I know the answer to, a cockle-doodle-doo. Keeps people thinking I'm a step ahead, or at least moving there. Some it shuts up. They figure they're behind, I guess. Others it intrigues because they want to see if I spit or swallow. At first, jabbering away on these tapes left me tired. I'd break for coffee and a word or two with your mother or peek at the television. But soon enough, I worked longer stints. In class, I showed a movie about Al Pacino doing Richard III. He compared iambic feet to an anteater, the front skinny and the end fat. Well, for the people I grew up with, any word, poetic or not, resembled a snake with a mouse in the middle, a little mouse, just a blip of a sound surrounded by its coming and going. It's not the King's English, but it's not my patois either. I'm impressed I know that word. Do you? Tell the truth now, damn it. Give your old man his due. Eventually, the sentences on the tape grew longer and more elaborate grammatically, like those I read instead of those I taught. What I said on the tape didn't resemble how I spoke, but instead how my head speaks to me. Ordinarily, I chose others' words, not to mimic them, but to remain inconspicuous. If you go to France, you speak French if you can. The trouble is, everywhere is foreign country to me. I've always felt like I was translating myself into another language, one I had some familiarity with, but was a long way from mastering. So now I'm yammering in this room with only four, a dog, to listen, and not too intently, I might add. Proof a man can bore a dog. Cats, everything bores, but I suppose a dog might pay attention out of loyalty. I guess I should give him a biscuit once in a while for his trouble. The truth is difficult to tell because there are so many. I'd like to say I have a monopoly on the subject concerning my own life, but it seems that a person accounting for himself is least qualified. If you have a conscience, it humbles you. If you don't, you turn out the hero. But even Christ raised hell with the money changers and fell apart at Gethsemane. The lackeys who never met the man wrote his gospels. I learned that from Elmira Jesus. He preaches to people now, just one or two at a time. I saw him at the beach. He'd sit in the shade and wave to whoever passed. He was polite and it encouraged people to listen to him. When they grew tired, he didn't ask them to stay. He didn't holler that they were hypocrites or blasphemers. But he's not around to call me out. So I've decided when I'm yapping into this thing and Four looks at me and cocks his head, I'm required to reconsider. The dog understands and bothers me only when I dodge my fears or brush with a complication or avoid a painful reckoning. More coffee seems required for this chore, and my cup held only drag, so I topped up. But I forget to switch off the machine. No, I didn't forget how. And doctors tell me I recall that sort of thing a good while longer. I'm not sure I listen like I ought to. I can separate someone's reason from just repeating a goddamn radio host propaganda, right or left, but that's just paying attention. Speaking with others in a room outside a classroom, you consider them before you talk. Alone, you're talking to yourself. Taylor, you explained to me watching the light changes it from some experiment from college, like that maybe, talking. But your mother believes it's written or spoken. A person eventually forgets it. Forgets others and tells himself the truth, or at least what he or she believes is true. So she's committed to the tapes. Recently, she suggested I play the tape aloud for her. She laughed in places I thought were funny, which was a relief. After a while, there were goddamn tears in her eyes. And in mine too. I asked her why she was crying, and she told me because I was. I suppose we could have gone into a long dialogue about what fueled my tears and why those reasons might turn hers. But what she said was enough. And me not answering or questioning her, that was enough too. And then I stopped it. We went to bed. She put herself under my arm and fell asleep, and I listened to her body take in air and exhale it, and found her pulse with my finger and felt her heart thump in that old iambic rhythm Shakespeare commandeered 500 or so years back. A muscle in my arm flickered, and I thought of all the places I could be, this was the best.
Nice, thanks, Bruce. Polly.
All right, so I'm reading from something new, which is always risky, but it suits the theme. It's the opening of a short story. It's called "You Can't Fool the Fat Man." I first met Sarah at Ghost Pond. She called it that because at night the echoes of coyotes bounce off the algaed surface and basalt cliffs. And once she saw an arm. The house my parents had built was one of many that would be just like it. The builders had no imagination and didn't allow modifications. But my parents paid a lot to live out here in the supposed wilderness. And they want what they want. They'd ordered new flooring and moved a bathroom wall. They complained about the noise of the other houses being built, the jackhammers against the basalt. Sarah told me the basalt won't budge. Fuck the jackhammers, says the basalt. But like us, she said, it feels like a losing battle. Like us? I asked. You know, she said, the fat man's gonna squash us. He's got his knee to our neck. I'm not a radical, but I knew what she meant. And something in me moved a little, like a bit of love and a bit of lust. Her parents were one of the many waiting for the basalt to give to the will of the jackhammers. They were waiting for their well before they built their house. Sarah told me she used to ride through here when she was a kid on her aunt's horse, who I've seen on the side of the road. He's black with white boots and a white chest, and sometimes he follows me along the fence line when I go for a run. He's too old to ride now, she said. We were sitting above the pond on a basalt outcropping. It was June and the water smelled like gas and growth and mud. I wondered if the person attached to that arm was somehow mummified in all that mud. I know that doesn't make any scientific sense, and I'll call dummy when it comes to science. I can blow a trumpet, and that's about it. But I couldn't shake my third grade lessons about tar pits and dinosaurs or the stories of bog people in my weird facts books. My parents deserve it, she said, and ran a finger around a puzzle piece of white moss painted in the rock. She told me her dog, a little cattle dog, used to sit on that horse's rump. No one was ever up here then, not ever, she said, just us. And now look. In the distance, the shapes of 6 new houses, one a skeleton, others move-in ready, 2 wrapped in white Tyvek, towered above the cheatgrass and sage, the ponds and basalt, above the tiny bitterroot flowers that had closed up for the night into pink buds with no leaves like little cocoons. The skeleton boards of the skeleton house glowed orangish in the dying sun. I imagined the body preserved in all that mud was a girl, like a young girl, maybe 7. I don't know why. I miss that dog, Sarah said. Maybe it was her I was picturing on her hippie aunt's horse with that cattle dog. Had she told me that dog had died? A sudden coolness rose from the pond, that high desert night air. Feel that? I said. Feels good. I kissed her then, a first bold kiss only allowed because of the cool, gassy air. She held my bare arm and kissed back, and that thick, cool air rubbed up against my skin as if I were sliding into a bog. For a moment, when I half opened my eyes, I felt the presence of a bog woman, her mossy hair on the back of my neck. We kissed like that for what felt like a long time, but may have just been minutes. I have to go, she said. The light on my bike is broken and it'll be complete dark soon. And anyway, she said, I don't need to be in any more trouble at home. Want to meet tomorrow? Can't. Protest. The next night? Sure, I can do that. We stood and kissed some more, clammy and muddy and fecund, and I walked her toward the road. Clear Lake came into view, the fading red on the horizon above the basalt cliffs like a distant wildfire. We'll wear masks, she said, at the protests. My parents think it's just the flu. It's not, she said. I nodded like I agreed. I looked for the arm on my walk back past the pond. I saw a branch sticking up and thought maybe that's what she saw. I followed a jeep trail back through the scablands, half a moon rising and lighting my way. The cranes and jackhammers threw eerie shadows across the basalt. I passed Deep Pond, which wasn't deep at all, but which in the spring is so black it looks bottomless. So black the reflections of new red shoots seem like the real thing, and the real things like pale replicas against a blue or white sky. I'd named the ponds and lakes back here. Only one is named on a map. For months I'd been wandering among the ponds and basalt. With stores and restaurants closed and school online, I'd had long days of wandering. My parents' house was the first built of the development, though there were a few houses on the edge before us, including the guy with the rabbits who target shot at stuffed animals and ceramic dolls. One coyote yipped and another answered, and in moments their calls echoed around me. I walked along the edge of Cattail Glade where the rabbit guy lived, lights on in his garage. My parents' bedroom light was blue with television. The outside light felt out of place in all this darkness. The road, newly graveled, snaked behind their house and behind the rabbit guy's house. The other roads were still mostly jeep trails. I unlocked the front door. The TV upstairs went quiet. That you, Patrick? My mom called down. It's me. I went into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and pulled out one of my father's Budweiser Golds. You're not eating this late. Just getting a soda, Mom. I went out to the back porch, the moon above Beaver Lake, the one named lake on the map, though it's really a long pond, through a wavering line of light like a lightsaber across its shallow surface, broken only by algae and brush crowding its shores. The beer settled into me. I met a girl today. I kissed that girl. The very first day I met her, COVID and all. I feel lucky and hopeful for summer.
Nice. Thank you, Polly. Greg.
Hey, so I wasn't sure what I was going to read, but I think I'll continue with the theme that Polly's sort of introduced with summer and lakes. So I'm going to read a scene from the tail end of a story. It's a fairly recent story. It's about a young man, college age, and he's on a canoe trip with his on and off girlfriend of many years. End of summer, and basically it's their last time together, though they don't exactly know this at the time. They sort of know it. Things have been going wrong for them all day, and the scene I'm going to read, they're going to get a lot more wrong. The only other thing you need to know is that the lake they're on is a man-made reservoir that once upon a time, before the hydroelectric dam was built, there was a logging town, which is now underwater where they are. Waking on the rocks, for a moment he has no idea where he is or how he got here. None of the surroundings are familiar. The day has gone from unrelenting heat and sun to early fall, the sky a lowering mixture of gray and black clouds. Marlia is no longer beside him. What woke him is the sound of her piling their stuff into the canoe, one paddle and another going in with a clang. "You're up," she says. "Good." Hands on her hips. She still has on his father's old Cargill baseball cap, but she's put on her Bowden sweatshirt, shorts, and sandals. A raindrop slashes him across the belly and another on the bare shoulder. Distantly, there's a rumble of thunder. What happened to their day? What happened to the whole summer? "Fuck," he says, and when he looks back at her, she's poised with one leg on the rock, the other in the canoe, ready to push off. "I know," she says. "I was totally out of it too, drank a few too many of those mooseheads. We'll be fine, but we need to get out of here now, like right now. Front, go to the front, I'll steer." He clambers in, arms out for balance, drops into position as she taught him in the bow. There's a slight wobble and catch as she pushes off and positions herself, and then the sound of water moving under them. "Go," she says, "take it away." "Do you ever think," he asks, once they've glided out, he wants to say something about the inky placidity of the water and the thickness of its color. How weird it is that there's only the water's surface tension and the shell of their canoe sliding along it now. Shifts in barometric pressure causing smells of sulfur and iodine to eddy unpredictably around them. Nothing more than this tenuous membrane of reciprocating pressures to separate them from the 1920s logging village, the lost world of all ended summers down there at the bottom of the lake. The way the water reflects the sky, it's almost like they're paddling into space. "Like, do you ever think," he begins again. "Shut up and paddle," she says. "It would help if you could try to be more even with your strokes. Draw left. I'm having a hell of a time here. Left, left. Jesus, have you ever been in a canoe before?" The only other times he's been in a canoe are with her. She knows this. Why ask? The wind comes from one side hard and then moves behind them, pushing him forward on his knees so he feels momentarily optimistic, buoyed beyond reason, but still panicked. Raindrops dimple the water's surface with this new direction and air pressure, and wind riffles it into miniature whitecaps as a swirl of warmer air touches him from behind. There's another rumble of thunder, and the clouds to the north flicker on and off. "What the fuck," he says. "We're like a fucking light bulb filament, right? May as well just flip a switch, light us up out here. Christ, could we be any stupider?" And paddling again. "What did we leave for? Why didn't we just stay on that rock and wait it out?" "Martin, this is not helping. You have no idea how long that would have been, and there isn't much daylight. Keep going." He hauls on the paddle handle, pulls and pulls, forgets everything she told him about form and the different kinds of strokes, different ways of angling the paddle for various effects. The smell of rain descends heavily with a blast of cooler air and ozone, and then it's raining for real, dumping. The skin on his bare arms is instantly goose-pimpled from the chill, and rain runs across his face and from behind his ears into his eyes. When he turns to glance back at Marley, he's not surprised that the Cargill hat is long gone, blown off somewhere. She smiles gamely in a way he realizes might be somewhat insane. She's enjoying this, the drama. "It's not the worst I've encountered," she yells. "It's bad, but not the worst. Don't worry, we're close now." Her hair is soaked and plastered to her head, no way of telling from it whether or not a lightning strike is imminent. Again and again, the clouds to the north flicker with lightning. "Close," he yells back. The shoreline looks like an eternally receding black, watery jumble of rocks and soil and trees. Water inches up around his knees. "How much water can we take on anyway before we sink? We should go back. Do we have a way to bail this thing out? Jesus Christ, should we stop and bail out?" "Just paddle. I know what I'm doing. Take it away, take it away." And then minutes later, or maybe hours, like she's worked some kind of magic trick, the inlet is in fact suddenly on their right, where it always is, the dark, narrower opening of shallower water they launched from, and a tailwind or current is pushing them sidelong into it. The wind eases as they angle closer to shore. Now he recognizes some of the shapes in the land, the little outcropping of rocks, and beyond that, the hummock of trees under which his dad's shitty old car is parked. Keep going, she says, don't wimp out on me. They roll the ground with a rattle of metal over gravel and sand, jump out, pull the canoe up behind them. See, she says. They flip the canoe and run for his dad's car. And as they sit out the storm, the light fading to a greenish and red-tinged late twilight strobe with flashes of lightning, wicked peals of thunder closer and closer, and the rain still driving down, bringing twigs and small branches with it, rattling the loose metal of the hood, he feels more thankful than he has words to express for the worn-out, comforting interior of that car. He looks at her and finally hears all his feeling for her again. Listen, listen, she says, pushing back slightly as he leans closer. Their eyes lock together, left eye to right eye to left eye. That smile, the mouth inside the outline of her mouth opening for him, drawing him into an unfettered intimacy he knows even as he's experiencing it, he'll probably spend the rest of his life trying to recapture. I wanted to tell you, she says. She pauses, rolls her eyes. But I wanted to wait until later. I'm kind of excited about it, but I took that offer for next year. You know, Scotland. I was on the fence all summer, like you know. So, but they called again a few weeks ago with another offer, and it's just so good. And I knew I have to go, like really, I have to go. So, but the thing is, I don't want to keep you hanging on. He's already shaking his head, like this isn't a problem. No, he says. No, let me put that differently. I don't want to hang on while I'm gone. I've been over and over it, and I've decided finally, it's just high time we let things go their natural course. Quit trying to be, she touches his nose, you know, maybe in another 10 years or whatever, who can say?
Thanks, Greg. I just have to say something because usually at any reading, I am the first person to say the F word. And this time it wasn't me twice, and it makes me so happy. So, Paula.
All right. Well, I thank you, Wendy, and A Book for All Seasons for doing this tonight. It's lovely, and it's an honor to be here with all these writers. I didn't know there was anybody else out there, to tell you the truth. I thought I was the only one here doing my thing. But anyway, so I'm going to read from my very first novel, which is Dove Creek. It came out in 2010 from a small press in Seattle. And I like these passages because the protagonist, who is a Kentucky woman who's immigrated out west, her name is Patricia Faye Morrison. She's kind of not very grown up. She's not very world-wise, and she gets herself in sort of a bit of trouble time and time again, and specifically having to do with the male types. And now I sort of liken her to the character in Looking for Mr. Goodbar, if anybody remembers that novel from back in the 60s. A few of you might. But so she's sort of this kind of competent person by day, but by night she's doing all the wrong things. And now she's decided to look at personal ads. This was in the days before the internet and online shopping for a date. And so she's turned to the personal ads, and she's starting to wake up a little bit to the fact that she's like destroying her own life. And it has to do with this connection that she's made with the Eastern Washington landscape. So I'm going to read two passages. One is just after, as one of the first dates that she went on is ending, and then the other one is kind of a flashback to another date that she did. The novel is Dove Creek. The problem is you, the mortgage broker had said, seated beside me on a creekside picnic table. The problem is you. Happiness comes from the inside, not someone else. He asked for my phone number, and I stumbled over excuses, requested time to think. Told him I was not as ready to date as I imagined. My brain warped against the intolerable image of him lounging satisfied in my bed. "This is your last time," I intoned. "You will not do this again." I walked the man to his car, left him alone beside it, and I drove south to Steptoe Butte, the site of the Coeur d'Alene battle with Colonel Wright and his troops, now a Washington State Park just west of Highway 27, midway between Tico and Oaksdale. Wheat towns in eastern central Washington, which run a line separating the Columbia River Basin from a bubbled plateau known as the Palouse. Steptoe Butte, the site of the Nez Perce and Coeur d'Alene tribes' conflict with the Army, is a mound of earth that fists out of the plateau, covered by Oregon adrift, volcanic ash from Mount Mazama millennia deep, ash turned to mousy brown loam heaped on the Idaho Rockies, freeing Mazama to become Crater Lake to generate a fortune as a national park. I hiked to the top, hoping to discern connection between the modeled landscape of my hopes and the wealth of a place born of Earth's anger, named for the same Palouse tribe who, alongside the Coeur d'Alenes, battled Colonel Wright and his men. The Palouse is a quadrillion tiny Steptoe buttes, an infinitesima of up and down walnut fuzz green, parched corn yellow, buff, sage, roan, here and there a bluff of dusty pine, mint to taupe, graphite gray edgeways turning solid under the wheels of rare traffic. But even this description is inadequate compared to its surrealism. And if I could not portray the imbroglio, the massive confusion that underlies, created, and is the Palouse, then how could I justify why once again I had landed in a situation that had disrupted and confused my own inner landscape? Perhaps that was why I was drawn to it, because chaos feels at home, even with ancient buried chaos. I had dreamed the night before of a shadowy Middle Eastern man, an emaciated Jesus, of handing him a bunch of webby grapes, dark globules, mysterious purple concords like those on the backyard vine of our childhood home, dark like hands full of sin, bitten in places then healed over as though by a groundhog or a woodchuck, some curious furry creature with long exact incisors, similar to the one that once bit my school-age Aunt Ava, only a few years older than I, garnering her the attention of my daddy and her daddy, my Uncle Gus, as they unrolled cigarette butts retrieved from the ashtray of Daddy's 39 Ford Coupe, the tobacco then mixed with spittle to form a poultice. I was angry at Jesus because of his attitude towards grapes, because he boastfully turned water into wine, a miracle that so blatantly skips over the grape's life, and so indirectly the reaper, keeper of the vine, the long years' work of nurturing and harvest all for naught. I lectured Jesus about the condition of the wedding wine. It was too quick, becoming itself from water rather than enduring the ages and processes required to transform grapes from the vine. I challenged Jesus just this once to bypass the miracle, take my grapes and make them into a bottle of wine. And then a little later, this flashback. I dated one man from the personals for 3 months. His name was Harvey, and he worked as a maintenance man in a hospital in a mountain town in North Idaho. Before I met him, he appeared in my dreams as a rabbit, easy enough to translate the metaphor if you know about Jimmy Stewart and old movies. In one dream, a little girl with blonde curls wearing an Alice in Wonderland dress came to me and asked if I could help her father. She led me to him over dry, flat desert land to a place of skulls and death. His right arm was missing, torn from its socket. How do you apply a tourniquet to his shoulder? The first night I stayed with Harvey, I saw the girl in a picture hanging along the up stairwell, congregated with framed photos of her brother and sister, baby faces, toddlers, school years, Christmases. Alice was Harvey's youngest daughter. He talked for hours about his children, about having grown up in the deserts of Southern Oregon, and about the illness and death of his younger brother and his father's subsequent suicide, about his mother who afterwards supported him by waitress in a Chinese restaurant with red vinyl booths and sculpture sculptured velvet wallpaper in a village apartment that had been a whorehouse. He played the guitar and sang songs for me, songs he had written. Then I slept with him in the bed he once shared with his wife, who left him to marry another maintenance man. After sex, he told me about the hospital secretary with whom he was in love, ballyhooed his boyish build, his uncontrollable hair as the reasons he could not attract her. I passed the remaining pre-dawn hours turned away from him, imagining myself a great sow with a litter of suckling pigs, staring at the night and its motionless gash of a moon through the sliding glass doors of his second-story deck. What a wonder it must be when two whole humans come together, like earth and 70-degree air, neither erupting or impacting the other. Sometimes I think we should return to living as humans did before the modern era, when people sat barefoot on stones, a time before language, when fire was the only poetry, affection traveling without symbol, a time before the first woman had to raise children alone. Perhaps language evolved out of feminine fear. Otherwise, wouldn't people have existed joyfully without words, without their accompanying templates of expectation? If the men of my history were more like the planet, dependable as the seasons changing colors, perhaps I wouldn't be at this place in life, seeking predictability from those detached and wondering the personal ads. If I'm unmarried all this time, does it make me a spinster? How long before I buy a dog, traipse to Europe with a singles group? How long before sex without sex, before the hymen closes, before the deflowering reverts to flowering, before the shadow falls long, dark, and cold as the bud closes, then shrinks to a stub, then to the dead, lifeless stalk of the winter before? The top of Steptoe Butte was 3,612 feet into the sky. Approaching 500 million years of age, she was the older mountain, the Steptoe, rising from a bed of younger basalt. This was my spirit as I saw it, me jutting bodily out of the soul of a child, still young, inexperienced, still chasing dreams. Steptoe was lonely too, her flock of smaller mountains and hills smothered, engulfed millions of years ago by unconscionable lava floods, molten rock from underground hundreds of miles away. Only Steptoe, the largest, remained uncovered, isolated in her grief, surrounded by stone-cold lava as it fell prisoner to ice-age deposits of loess up to 200 feet deep. This was eventually called the Palouse, some of North America's most fertile ground. Thank you.
Thanks, Paula. And Noah.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here. I'll be reading, I haven't read from this in a while, but I'll be reading the prologue of my book, Spirit Run. So hope it goes well. 2003. Among the pines of Bella Coola in Canada's British Columbia, Canadian authorities escort a 17-year-old mother in handcuffs to identify and unearth the site where she buried a baby son a few days earlier. The teenage mother's name, Crow, of the Secwepemc Nation, whose full name translates to water waves, is reflected in her tears. The baby she buries was her firstborn son, pronounced dead at 7 weeks old. For 49 days, her baby lived with the power of a name, under the protection of Secwepemc tradition of caring for one's own, blanketed with the dreams of a mother who thanked him until the very end when he stopped eating. Fearing that the hospital would take him away, Crow wrapped him into the cradle board and escaped with him into the forest. She remembers at night in the mountains as very cold. The rain pelleted her as she and 2 others encircled the boy in a wall of ceremony before digging up a spot in the muddy earth with a shovel. The Secwepemc people bury their own, but on this February day, the authorities unearthed the body of the infant Nupika Amak, one who can travel between 2 worlds, reversing the sacred order by which a Secwepemc mother makes peace with the loss of a son. They desecrate the earth in front of her, land that had laid claim to Nupika Amak's spirit, and bring him back to this world to be processed, tagged, and issued both a birth and death certificate. then to take his mother back into custody for questioning. When asked why she didn't register her baby, because she wanted him to be a freedom baby, free from government oppression. In 2004, in a salmon fish hatchery in Shikaloon Village, Alaska, where snow is still thickly packed onto the ground and the air cuts a person's face like obsidian glass, 30-year-old Chula Pepper, a traveler from San Diego, California, stares into a mirror of a bathroom with a Swiss Army knife in hand. No job, no relationship, no home. She grabs her long hair and cuts, like sickle to wheat, long black strands before settling onto the cold floor, nearly bald. She shivers over the few things to her name: a backpack, some clothing, a sleeping bag, rain pants, and a troubled past. Tomorrow, she decides, life will be different. In the small town of Smithers, Canada, 19-year-old Zanya Lone Wolf of the Gitsan and Dakel nations quits her job flipping burgers at a McDonald's and relinquishes her role as caretaker of a household in torment, an incarcerated father, a drug-addicted mother, and a murdered cousin along Canada's highway of tears. Against her mother's wishes, she withdraws what little savings she has from an ATM, purchases a backpack, and breaks from all she has ever known to join a caravan of indigenous runners. Still farther north, in one of the coldest parts of the Vaishraiku, or Arctic village, Alaska, an elder named Ipana packs her life of 60 years into 5 oversized suitcases and travels to join the others, indigenous runners from across the world, congregating in Alaska for a race through North America toward Panama. In Fairbanks, Ipana, a leader in the Diné territories, a community aligned with the migration patterns of the porcupine caribou, faces a wind and thinks about those ancient runners who had passed through these lands, migratory protectors of the sun who had moved with the herds of caribou. The time has come for Ipana to find within herself the spirit of those runners, the sun people, to find the courage to leave home and spread an urgent message. The Arctic is dying. Around the same time in Oakland, California, 29-year-old Cheeto awakes to the day on which his dream will come true. A dream of a run that unifies all the people of the world and that takes him far away from an area he no longer feels a part of, the Bay Area, to which he was brought over from Mexico when he was only 2 years old. He quits his job at EB Games, said goodbye to his nieces and nephews, and scavenged the Bay Area's thrift stores for warm clothing. He packs his backpack, takes farewell photos with family, then washes down a couple of Heinekens at a going-away party this afternoon. The next morning, he boards a gray van, which will take him to Alaska. Alone in the Hazlitt Basin, in the foothills of the Sierra Mountains in Fresno, California, a man dials into his Apache and Purepecha heritage, beating a drum for guidance. Here, beside a fire pit among ponderosa pines in ceremonial sweat, Andre prepares himself spiritually and mentally to co-lead runners through North America. He meditates for the courage and the clarity to lead indigenous warriors safely across vast lands. He sings and stokes the fire, calling on the wisdom of his Apache mother and Vietnam veteran elders who taught him about committing to things that are bigger and greater than oneself. He channels the wisdom of the medicine bag around his neck, Apache protection, he calls it, and drives a gray van all the way down to Los Angeles to pick up runners before driving far north to Alaska in search of that person that his father wasn't. In Arizona, there's a man whose soul is branded by the tragedy of the copper mine strike of 1983. He, Pacquiao, the main leader of the run, was about 10 years old when he witnessed his hometown of Ajo, Arizona on lockdown, martial law enforced, the town besieged by bulldozers, snipers, police, and the National Guard. It was an event that displaced many residents, separated families, and converted the place into a near ghost town. For 4 days and 4 nights, Pacquiao of Yaqui and Tohono O'odham and Opatal heritage submerges himself in ceremony in an arid region of southern Arizona. He sweats, fasts, and prepares himself to carry forward the immense weight laid upon him 2 years prior by the elder Gustavo, his mentor, a prominent labor movement leader and the founder of the sacred marathons across North and South America, held every 4 years, known as the Peace and Dignity Journeys. Pacquiao co-organizes with Andrek and Chula Pepper a safe route across North America, starting in Alaska. After securing and loading up the vans, Pacquiao leads a caravan north to Shikaloon, Alaska. On the way, he gives lectures and picks up runners. In Sonora, Mexico, two Yoreme Nation brothers, Masat, also called El que corriendo mata, or he who runs conquers, and his older brother Greñas, take leave of their families and university studies to hitchhike several days north to the US border. They journey to fulfill an obligation to their elders, to surrender to the run and embrace the way of the warrior, those committed to the protection and preservation of the land, animals, and their people's culture. These are only some of the marathoners of Peace and Dignity Journeys 2004. They are ordinary people, proud of their heritage, summoned by a call greater than themselves. And then there's me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for folks, attendees who are sending in questions. Keep sending those. So we're going to address some of the questions now. Again, feel free to ask anything. You know, I want to start because we kind of frame this as Eastern Washington, but in the last reading there, Noah, you're writing about all types of different lands, and one of the questions that maybe you can start out with is that how closely is landscape related to character in people's work? You know, and some folks are writing fiction. I'm primarily a fiction writer, but I think that a lot of even my fictional characters closely in some ways resemble some of my own lived experiences. But I'm interested to hear what everyone has to say about that. But maybe if you want to start about the connection to the land in terms of yourself as a character in your book, as it is a book of nonfiction.
Great question. No, for me, nonfiction is imperative. I mean, writing about landscape in my work is imperative. It's always informed my life. It was always my escape. Growing up, not being able to have a handle on language. Language was a very scary thing for me growing up, navigating between Spanish and English. And so I was always turning to landscape. And landscape was always something for me to sort of create a space for myself in my language, finding new words. And so when I write about this book, I couldn't tell this book without the landscape. There's a very spiritual element for me in the land. There's a healing element in it for me too. And so I wanted to convey as much of the landscape in my book so that people can find that as an option for them, you know. In my upbringing, right, and in my culture and in indigenous culture, you know, land is very, you know, it's a religion. And so you're very much tied to your land, but there's also a lot of trauma when you're displaced from that land. So my people coming from Mexico, you know, there's a lot of stories that get lost along the way. And so for me, it was part of recuperating the story of my people was recuperating my understanding and my relationship to the land, and that it required work. And so for me, first it started with retransforming my relationship to the land of Yakima, and primarily was around orchards and what that meant, which is the physical labor around that. And so for me, I was sort of displaced from my own love of the land. So I needed to get back to it. And part of it was coming back to Yakima, a different person. And in order to do that, I had to run across North America into Mexico. And so, and reestablishing my connection with land through the eyes and through the teachings of elders who knew the land and honored the land. And so they were teaching me this, and they were making me help me find the words to show that love and that connection that I had with land. So for me, I can't do what I do without the land, and for me it is a prominent character in my writing.
Totally. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
What do other people think? Other comments? Just about, you know, that how character is related, landscape is related to character.
I was just thinking about two things, and one, just the piece that I read, that the one thing that those two characters have in common, because they clearly don't have a lot in common, is the landscape and their kind of instinctual reverence for it. I was also, I worked for a long time on a novel about Death Valley, and its inhospitableness attracts a certain type of character, and those characters were really fun to write about because they're so hard scrabble. And in some ways, you know, Eastern Washington reminds me a little bit of that. And so, you know, I think about characters that the characters that I write that are here are typically a little on the hard scrabble side. And I think it's part of the landscape. And then, you know, my characters placed other places. It's a totally different feel.
I think there's a element of, from my experience, self-annihilation in the Western, the experience of landscape and living in the West. It's almost like, and this is different than the indigenous experience, I think, in that you're trying to imagine yourself out of it. Wouldn't this be perfect if nobody was here? And I think that has a lot to do with the sort of tragic quality of the Western as a genre, and the tragic quality of the West as well. I mean, the West is the history of white expansion is people coming west because they don't fit anyplace else, and in the process creating tracks for other people to follow, which really destroys the reason they came and they came out there in the first place. And so I'm interested in that from my cultural experience. My family were homesteaders. I'm interested in that idea of that tragic quality of this place is perfect without me.
Greg, were you going to say something?
Yeah, that was really interesting. What Bruce was just saying. I guess, I mean, it kind of goes along with that a little bit. I think I'm always thinking about landscape is going to be important to the story, whatever it is that I'm writing. But I don't know, like I wish that I could claim that there was a particular landscape that really had this sort of spiritual hold on me. But the fact is, I've lived so many places, there are many landscapes that have that kind of feeling for me. And I'm always experiencing them as a transplant, even though, I mean, I've lived here now for 20 something years. It doesn't feel like this is the place I've lived the longest. I still feel like a transplant. And so, I mean, like, that's always been my strat. I mean, like, Fiddler's Dream was set in Nashville, and it really needed to be in Nashville because it's a music story. But the kid in that story is from Vermont, so he's a transplant, you know, experiencing what it's like to be in the South. And that gave me a way to sort of, I don't know, to sort of filter it. And I guess, you know, the same thing's true with the Nutshot, you know, set up in Alberta. I'm not from Alberta, but my characters are transplants there. And I guess we're always kind of transplants wherever we are. And there's some element to that in how you're experiencing. And like Bruce is saying, like, there's so much that's already been annihilated, and there's so much sameness wherever you go. If you're writing about any kind of urban experience, you almost don't have to say where you are. And I think there's a real tradition in American literature of writing about any town USA, which would kind of do away with setting altogether and just homogenize experience to a sort of generic urban box store experience, which there's a lot of fiction that does that. I don't think, I try to not do that, but I also at the same time don't feel like hey, I'm a Western writer, I'm a West Coast writer, I'm a whatever, I don't know what I am. So whatever the story presents me with, the setting changes for it, has to go with it, has to match the characters, has to fit with it. You know, Nukshuk had to be set in Alberta and on King William Island because it's about the Arctic and it's about desolation. I don't know. So I had to imagine what it would be like to live there. I spent a lot of time there, but I'm not from there.
I want to quickly follow up because you said something really interesting. It's like the story and then the landscape follows after you've created the characters or after you've created the story. Like it has to be set in Nashville because it's a music story. It has to be set here because it's this. And I'm curious about other people if the landscape comes first and then the characters arise out of the landscape.
I think that's the way it is for me. Almost all of my characters are rural women, definitely rural people, and have a very obvious connection and relationship with the landscape. That's just part of what I do, I guess. I can't think of a person or imagine a person without imagining their relationship with the land around them and the place they're in. But as I said, always writing about rural folks. That's what I come from. I can't separate one from another. I think that we all extend from the landscape ourselves, even in urban areas, even in places where we're completely disconnected, where it would be really hard to take off your shoes and walk barefoot on the dirt. I still feel like that we extend from the land. And for me, I just think it would be really hard to write about any character without considering their relationship with the place that they're in, whether they've been there their whole lives, or they're an immigrant, or they're a transplant. I feel like one just goes with the other. And I think that place very often becomes character too, in part because of that. So that was it.
But I think place, we tend to limit landscape we tend to limit place to landscape sometimes out in the country we live, because there's a lot of room between towns and between people. I remember the first time I visited New York, it was like going to a national park. I felt at the bottom of this great chasm, and that I knew that people had to respond to being in that place differently than I responded to being, than I responded to being in the place I was. So to me, place isn't limited to landscape.
That's certainly true if you think of like Stuart Dybek writing about Chicago.
Exactly.
And like that, I mean, you wouldn't think anyone could wax more poetic about a setting than he does about that particular setting. And it's hardly beautiful landscape. I mean, it's the hideousness and the sort of grit of it that he loves is really particular to Chicago. And that's, I don't know, that's so place heavy. It's one of my favorite books. But on the other hand, like I've been on this kick reading Susan Choi's books because she's coming here to visit. And it's really interesting what she does with place, because obviously she has a place in mind, but she will never say what it is. You know, Trust Exercise, she never says that book is set in Atlanta. She just talks about it being a hot city somewhere. And place feels really, the book feels really suffused with place, feels really important to the characters. She will never tell you what the city is. And the same is true in this other book of hers that I'm reading. It's like, it's somewhere, I think it's Cornell University, but she will not say it's Cornell University. It's somewhere sort of close to Canada on the border in a college town. Place is really important, but she won't name it. And I think that's equally fascinating and just as effective. Like it's the story is enlivened by place, even though it never gets named, but you could never not say Chicago in a Stuart Dybek book.
That's interesting. That's actually really interesting. One of the attendees asked the question, which dovetails into this, but essentially, what is the emotional connection, right? I mean, because there's the places that, like, for me, I feel a type of emotional pull to the Okanagan, North Central Washington, and lived in that rural orchard country. And I always, even if I'm writing about somewhere else, I always have that kind of emotional connection. And that's interesting what you're saying too, Greg, about like Stuart Dybek writing about Chicago, then Susan Choi not naming it, but there still is like kind of a location there. So I'm curious what other people have to say about what their pure like emotional connection is to a place, whether it's nostalgic or whether it's angry. I mean, I felt like for a long time, and the writer Tiffany Quay Tyson writes about this. She grew up in a small town in Mississippi, and she said she couldn't wait to get out of there. But then the minute that she left, it was all she could write about because she was so emotionally linked to the idea, and it was so much a part of her identity.
It's funny that the place I grew up in, I don't write about because it's devoid of place in a lot of ways. It's suburban. And I think that any place I go, I develop a strong attachment to the land regardless. But when I think about story, I think the location is one of the things that I determine early, even before the story. So, you know, I'm at Bumbershoot and I see a kid playing Dust My Broom on a 6-year-old playing Dust My Broom on a metal guitar, and I think there's a story here, not about that kid, but that takes place at this festival, and whoever is in this story sees that child, and so the story rose up out of a place. Right. And I think that's true of, you know, Death Valley. You know, who lives here? Who would be up here? And part of that is greedy. How can I write about this? Because I love it, because my heart is there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I was thinking how a character wrestles with their environment, right? And so for me, the reason personally in my memoir that I wrestle with the environment is this notion of displacement, right? Where certain people or certain character that it doesn't have the privilege of deciding the place, right? That it's sort of been determined for them, you know, generation after generation. And so it's imperative to reclaim a space within yourself spiritually, but also, you know, a specific place, and you can only get so close, right? And so you find yourself wandering and finding attachment to many landscapes, but you're oriented towards the land, and at least personally, right? And so for me, it's important because, you know, landscape does come first. I go out and I sit and I people watch, and, you know, stories emerge from that. But there's something powerful in trying to write about how a person wrestles with their place or their landscape, right? And so, and there's a lot of emotion to that, right? And depending on your feelings towards it, all the things that a land did for you or didn't do for you growing up, or what it can do for you. And so I think that's the motivation for me, is all the wonderful things that it can still do for you, right? And you know, the healing that it can bring or whatever. But yeah, I think it's a work in progress, but it's a really interesting one for me. It's a really fun one for me. It's a really powerful one to consider place in my story. And if one day I venture into fiction or whatever, I think that's always going to be my motivation. And landscape is always going to be at the forefront, because you know, I'm curious. You know, it's important to stay curious and to remain vigilant. And I guess maybe that's what it is that people, we grow up to be vigilant of our surroundings. So we kind of grow up becoming hyper aware and observant of our surroundings. And so I sort of want to reflect that in my writing, that I grew up very hyper aware of my surroundings, suspicious, or maybe. And so, I mean, that's just one sort of way of looking at it. But so I try to do that work and in the details, you know, so I utilize a lot of details and try to remove as much judgment, of those details as possible, so that I can create a complicated narrative enough so that when people come at it from different worlds, they can pull out their own meaning from it as well.
No, thank you. That idea of the difference between the privilege of choosing a place, that's hugely insightful, and brings the idea of privilege into a kind of focus that I will think about for a long time.
Thank you. I mean, there's that notion, I think, I forget, coming across like the tyranny of place too.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
like sometimes we don't want to think about it, but it's always come back to us, right?
I think it's a good point. The idea that there's definitely a certain amount of privilege in choosing where you want to be. I thank you for bringing that up too, because I often don't think about that. I lose sight of that piece, that I am where I am because I chose to be here. I chose to be here because of the influence on my writing, and because of the stories that came to me from being in this place. But I don't stop to think about the fact that I'm privileged to be able to choose to be here. That's just not the case for everybody. So thank you. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, well, and even like the notion of the language of of transplant, like Greg had said, feeling like a transplant in places, that sort of implies that folks are in an area that they picked it, right? We have time for one more comment if anyone else has a question.
Well, I mean, I guess I want to put a little bit more of like, when I say transplant, I don't mean that like largely not by choice. I mean, like my family all fled pogroms in Europe basically to come here, and that wasn't their choice really. It was their only choice. And then surviving, and for as far as my own sort of like peregrinations around the country, they've all been job related or work related, not, I mean, yeah, that's a choice, I suppose, a privilege, a choice, whatever. But it's also it's a necessity, really. I mean, I'm not here in Spokane necessarily because it's where I wanted to be. I like it, but it was a job that brought me here. So, I mean, and basically like what I've learned over the years is like certain landscapes really I do connect with them and have like a strong feeling that I love sort of mining for words and sentences and characters, but I don't actually have the luxury of living in those places full time. Like for me, that would be the Northeast a lot. So like Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, there's like a sentimental attachment or emotional attachment I have to a lot of the geography there. I don't have the privilege of living there because of the kind of life that I've chosen. I can't live there full time. I can go there. California, I have a similar kind of feeling, real strong feeling. But if I want to write about Nashville, I've got to sort of force myself to feel like I love that landscape, even though I don't. Never did when I lived in Nashville, but I've got to find a way to mine that landscape. Same with Alberta. Like I've spent a lot of time there. I don't love it. It's never spoken to me in any way, but I had to find a way to feel like, oh, I really love that flat, cold, gray. Just, it can be beautiful, like a sunset on the prairie can be really, really amazing, kind of like nothing anywhere else. But I don't love it. It doesn't inspire me, but if my characters are there, my story's there, I got to find a way to, like recently I wrote a couple stories that are set in Frank Slide, which is in British Columbia on your way to Alberta. It's like nothing. It's a rock slide. There was the second biggest rock slide in Canada there like in the early 1900s, 1800s, I can't remember exactly when, but it's still, the town is buried under rubble, and you drive through and it's just rocks, but there's a town there. And I just like, I felt this real attraction to write about that place. And I can't say it's beautiful, or I don't know. Anyway, it's complicated. We have a really complicated relationship with place because we're, as a species, we're forced to move around so much, I think. Or that's been my experience anyway.
Mm-hmm. Great. One question Jackie asked, I would love to hear more from people about Noah's idea of reclaiming self and reclaiming landscape.
I think I'm not sure this is what you're asking, but for me, reclaiming landscape has to do with development. I lived in Florida, and the development was annihilating. And I fell in love with the landscape. I mean, and it was horrible. In my college, you know, you drove across some islands that were made of trash, landfill created the islands. You know, and I was a kid on tiny islands, digging for clams, and then the islands had condominiums on them. And so I think all the time in my fiction, I'm reclaiming the landscape. Right now I have, development going up behind my house, which is where the story that I read tonight arises out of. And, I'm writing stories around this development that might be coming in, when somebody decides to buy that giant chunk of basalt. And so, I mean, I engage in every little corner of it, even if, there are cattle to deal with. Because, yeah, so reclaiming landscape has to do with the landscapes that I've lost, and trying to find them wherever I can. And if that means going to the most inhospitable place in the country, because, yeah, then I will do that. Imaginatively or otherwise.
I think sometimes reclaiming landscape is an effort to reclaim experience. And that's a pretty hard thing to do because experiences are gone. And so I think it depends on how you approach it. I think that, some of the ugly things that are happening in this country and in the West are examples of people trying to reclaim what they see as an experience that's passing them by. So, I think that complicates the relationship with landscape in a way that's, to me, really troubling.
Well, I like what you said earlier too. I mean, it's in direct conflict with what I said, but I like that tension and that is, if we want a landscape with nobody in it, then we don't want ourselves in it either.
Yeah, well, I don't see what we're saying as disagreeing at all. I think it's all part of the same sort of tragedy.
At the very least, we have the space within our page, right? And then that's where you can make those gestures that are true to you, find those words that bring the magic, that bring the medicine, do the details that capture those landscapes that may or may not be there, right? And make meaning of it and pass it on and hope that carries on in some way. through a story or whatever. So at the very least, I know that that's been my liberty, at least, is doing it on the page and doing what I can on that as well.
I love that. I think that is sort of the end of our questions. So I want to thank everyone for hanging out with us for the last almost 90 minutes. And I'm going to put a link in the chat for attendees. This has everyone who is on here. If you want to check out more or about people's bios, take a look at books. But either way, awesome discussion, and really nice to hear from, for me personally, from a lot of writers that I admire, new work. So attendees, you guys got a total sneak peek of what is to come. So there is a recording of this. It will probably be on the Book for All Seasons social media. And with that, again, just thanks everyone for coming, and have a great night.
And
Thank you,
Wendy,
everybody.
and A Book for All Seasons, you guys, everybody should support
Thank
your
you.
Yes.
local
Yes.
store.
Yes.
Yeah.
Even if you don't see a book on their website, they can get it for you.
Thank you.
So nice talking with y'all.
Bye.
Great to talk to you.
Thanks.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Yes.